Subbarao Garu and other distinguished members on the panel, Professor Prasanna Kumar. At the outset, I would like to thank the Center for Policy Studies and the Gayatri Vidya Parishad for giving me this very, very special honor and privilege. As all of you know, or the most of you know, I come to Vizag quite happily and regularly since I say I belong here. And whenever I come, Professor Kumar very kindly allows me this opportunity to share my thoughts. And I generally do what could be called as a rather traditional and predictable lecture on national security. So this time, when I mentioned that I would be able to come in February or March, his interest in cricket is well known. So we spoke, and then a few minutes later, I got a call again. And it was one of those typical Prasanna Kumar googlies. He said, if you are coming to Vizag, why don't you do the Abid Hussain lecture? And as I said, it was both a great privilege, but perhaps more than a privilege, it was as daunting to say that, can I measure up to this task of delivering a lecture of this sort? And I confessed to him, I said, I have never done a memorial lecture, so you'll have to give me some indulgence. And I would seek that from all of you, because listening to the speakers before me and looking at this audience, I can clearly see that many of you knew Dr. Abid Hussain in far greater measure than I did. But notwithstanding, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to recognize many people in the audience. I think the panel and those sitting on the dais have been introduced in some detail. But when I'm sort of standing here, there are many people who I associate with Vizag and who have been mentors for me, even as I grew up. Mr. Subramaniam of the Hindustan Shipyard, Mehdi Saab, who's been a very regular figure for all our events, Commodore Gomes, Dr. Mukunda, and various other people. And in this list, I want to introduce my close friend, who very happily I discovered only this morning that he's in Vizag, Ambassador Amit Dasgupta. He's retired recently as Ambassador of India, now in Vizag. Deepaji is now here. So on Facebook, when we made contact, I happily made this discovery. So Amit, welcome to Vizag. You are amongst friends. And this is a group that I have been talking to every time I come. And I want to thank the center and the Gayatri Vidya Parishad for keeping this kind of environment nurtured. That Vizag has a forum like this that allows us to collectively share a few thoughts on a number of issues. And the Abid Hussain Memorial Lecture, I think, is a particularly special moment. And what I thought I would do, with your permission, Prasanna Kumar Garu, will about half an hour, 30 minutes, that I thought I would also add my own tribute to Abid Saab. And some of you may be aware, I grew up in Vizag. I was here from 1956 onwards. And when he was Collector Vizag, I was a young schoolboy in Sainik School, Korakunda. And those of you who saw Abid Saab, I would say, till the very end, he had this mop of hair, which he used to sort of throw back with gay abandon. And in those days when we were very young, he was this very, very iconic collector. And when he came to our school, the few occasions, and gave us a prize or whatever, as Sharma Sahib has said, he always had that ability to connect even to the smallest school kid and, speak to you, ask you something. And this is a trait, as I said, that was very, very special. And as I got to know him over the years, I only, as I said, my own more recent acquaintance with him was in the last 10 or 12 years. First, when he was ambassador to the US. As Sharma Sahib pointed out, in the early 90s, he was our ambassador. I was then in the IDSA, and we were passing through a very tense phase in the India-US relationship. I was then in an institute called the IDSA, and we were identified to open a dialogue with the United States on some very sensitive issues related to nuclear matters and terrorism. And Mr. K. Subramaniam, our former director at the institute, very often he used to be the leader of our delegation, and we used to go to Washington. And when Abid Saab was ambassador, you really got a sense about the way in which, I think, as you said when you were president of ASCI, principal of ASCI, he could, in a way, make a very tense situation very malleable. he had this rare ability, and he had this, I would say, the administrative acumen, if I could put it that way, to be able to see an issue from the American side, because those of you who knew Mr. Subramaniam, he was very binary on the nuclear issue. And he had a very strong sort of sense. But to convey that, I would say that the mediation was done by various ambassadors, but most effectively the little bit that I saw by Dr. Abid Hussain. And there are many stories. I'll just relate one which I thought was quintessential Abid Saab, that in his early months as ambassador, this was a very tense time both in India-US relations, and those of you who remember our own very checkered history at the time, if I remember right, it was perhaps post-Babri Masjid. And there was a lot of, shall we say, anxiety about India and the way it was dealing with the issue. And as the anecdote goes, a certain congressman came very agitated to the Indian ambassador, Abid Saab, and said, "Mr. Ambassador, we are very concerned. You are the world's largest democracy. And I gather that the Muslims in your country are discriminated against. What do you have to say? You yourself are a Muslim of India." So Abid Saab, as the story goes, if you know the ambassador's office in Washington, he looked at him, and in his very typical way, there's something very Parisian about Abid Saab, muffler, tie, around his neck. He had very sort of long, sensitive fingers, so he ran them through his hair. He looked at the congressman and he says, "Mr. Congressman, you're absolutely right. Muslims in India are discriminated against." So this congressman was quite taken aback, and he was wondering what else. And the staff around the ambassador wondering, what is he saying? Has he got his talking points right? He says, "Yes, the Muslims are discriminated against. But let me tell you, so are the Hindus. And so are the Christians." And this congressman was a bit stumped, and he went on. He said, "So are the Buddhists." And Abid Saab could make out from the congressman's name what his own religious affiliation was. And he said, "So are the Jews, by the way." So in this quintessential manner, he was able to convey, and the last line was to say that India is a noisy democracy, but everybody is equal, and everybody is discriminated against. So this was the way in which, Abid Saab, as I said, had this rare ability, but behind this humor and his affable nature, there was also what I would call as this administrative acumen and his ability to connect all the dots. And again, I was very, I would say, fortunate that he was asked to head the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation after he had finished his stint in the United States. And since I happened to be working in a think tank at that time, he would always, make it out that, "Are, Uday bhai, lambi baat karni hai." And we would meet at the IIC or wherever for a chat. And it seemed as if Abid Saab was deferring to me because I was in a think tank and he was trying to understand, ye karna chahiye, wo karna chahiye. But the manner in which he could draw you out. And in a way, I often used to joke with him saying, "Sir, you make me jump, if I can jump 3 feet, you make me jump 4 feet by constantly asking me to do this, do that." And you found that you were doing a lot of things because it was Abid Saab's very, very special way of relating and making you feel. And I'm very fortunate that because, as I said, of his very special combination of head and heart, almost till the very end. And he had a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas about Hyderabad, about Andhra, about India. You could see the way in which he could relate. And almost everything for him was, seen in the prism of the nation. And that, I thought, was something that he always brought. And, I'm very privileged to be here. Thanks to all of you. And I'm very sort of glad that Vizag has taken this initiative to have a memorial lecture. And as Sarma Sahab has said, and Subbarao Garu, that I hope this will be the beginning of, a sustained way of recalling what Abid Saab was to all of you. Now, as far as the lecture today, I was debating as to how I should structure it. I thought I would pick up a phrase because this used to come up very often whenever I used to talk to Abid Saab in Delhi in the last decade, which is about Vizag. And I think it was he who had coined this phrase, city of destiny. And he used to often talk about Vizag and the potential that Vizag had. But in the same breath, he used to rue the fact, and in a very wry way said that, this destiny has remained elusive. That while Vizag has done many things, and more recently he was, I would say, slightly troubled about a number of developments. I would not say that he had anticipated that this very, very significant decision has been taken as far as Telangana is concerned. But all I would say in summary is that he was uneasy about various things which were related both to Andhra, now we talk about composite Andhra, and what will follow, and about India at large, and various other issues. And here was a man who had worked across the board. I just want to recall, I remember once talking to the Honorable Vice President, Mr. Hamid Ansari, when he was the chairman of the Minorities Commission. And Abid Saab, in his UN days, was, if I'm not mistaken, again, the first rapporteur for freedom of expression under the UN aegis. And again, you know, as I said, beneath this veneer of affability, being laid back, there was a tremendous amount of intellectual capital that he used to bring to bear and some insights. And as I said, I'm just paraphrasing that at the national level, I think Abid Saab was very disturbed and troubled about various trends that were emerging in the Indian polity. The collector, Mr. Arokiraj, spoke about moral turpitude. And I think that's a very significant phrase. And we ourselves know in our own way that in the last few years, there have been a number of developments that can only be described as undesirable. And in that sense, as I said, Abid Saab was, able to keep his eye and, track various things. And I was just wondering that what can I tell an audience like this in Vizag and on the first memorial lecture for Abid Saab? I've taken the liberty of using this particular phrase, City of Destiny, as the takeoff point and try and dwell upon what is it that Abid Saab had envisioned for Vizag, perhaps, when he had spoken about the city as the city of destiny, and what is it that we collectively can do today in 2014. And I think all of you in this audience have contributed significantly to the evolution of Vizag in your own time. And when Subbarao Garu says that we are now looking at the new generation, that in this audience there is also what I would call as the future of Vizag, the stakeholders, those who perhaps are below 50. I myself have now reached a stage where I'm senior citizen. I get a concession from the Indian Railways, amongst others. So like in that famous Bill Clinton phrase, I have, like some others in this audience today, more yesterdays than tomorrows. But there are some amongst you who are stakeholders. And I'm making these remarks in a very earnest sort of manner, hoping that you will be able to do something with this, which is Vizag as a city of destiny. Where has Vizag reached and where should Vizag reach? And I want to make three broad observations, if I may, which is that you enter Vizag. I came yesterday in the airport, and I was very happy to see that phrase there on one of the billboards, which talked about Vizag as a jewel in the East Coast. And I was wondering as to how I should frame today's remarks. I did some homework. Mr. Prasanna Kumar always has this ability to make me do a fair amount of homework every time I come to Vizag for a chat of this type. And this being a more formal lecture, I did some homework on Vizag. And there are three broad points that emerged to me. One is that when we talk about any city, Vizag is an exemplar of the great cities of the world. And if you place this in a historical context, in the long cycle of history, one is, for almost every great city, it would be a tenet to just recall that geography is destiny. And in terms of the evolution of the city itself, we know that almost all ancient civilizations have been linked to great rivers of the world. Whether we talk about our own Indic civilization and the great rivers of India, the Ganges amongst others, or the Indus Valley civilization, or for that matter in Asia we have the Mesopotamian or the Chinese civilization, or Egypt and the Nile, the correlation where cities and civilizations have been shaped by their geography. And in a more recent context, you can see the correlation between the great cities of the world and their affinity with the sea, the great ports of the world. And if you look at Visakhapatnam in a global context, we are now living in an age where you can crunch numbers and get any kind of global or regional classifications. And I was not aware till I did this little homework that when you look at the global cities, Visakhapatnam ranks at 122nd in terms of the great cities of the world. It has a population of over 2 million. And there are some interesting statistics. One is that it is also ranked amongst the 10 most developing cities of the world, fastest developing cities of the world. These are 2012 figures. And I was not aware of this. It is also listed as one of the 10 cities which is considered to be the most business friendly and which has the potential to go with the new technologies. These are new things. And in the same breath, I realized that when we talk about antiquity, Vizag goes back in a recorded sense. I'm sure there are historians and archaeologists here who might correct me, to as far back as 300 BC. It's Buddhist past, and then goes through these 2.5 millennia, and we are now in the early part of the 21st century. So if we locate Vizag and say, why did Abid Saab at that time choose this particular phrase, city of destiny? And since I have grown up in this city and I know each decade as to what has been the trajectory of Vizag, I think it would be fair to say that in terms of its geography, in terms of its history, and in terms of the promise, Vizag has many distinctive elements and features to it. And whichever way you were to classify and index, whether we talk about Vizag and its own relevance as far as the East Coast is concerned, one of the little nuggets I found was that one of the oldest schools in India, particularly on the East Coast, is my school, St. Aloysius, which came up in 1849. And then, of course, you have various other characteristics that we associate with the city. But whether it is the steel plant, for which we again acknowledge Dr. Abid Hussain, or all the other facets of the city, its industrial profile, the fact that it is headquarters to the Navy's Eastern Naval Command, and various other new additions that have come to the city, including the fact that today it is recognized as a very important IT hub as far as peninsular India is concerned. When the urban population of the world is going to be greater than its so-called non-urban population, and this is going to pose a great challenge to existing cities. So when we talk about collectors, city administration, and various other aspects of every city, whether in India or elsewhere, it's going to strain and challenge existing infrastructure. And it's in this context that if you look at how cities are evolving, there are various ways of assessing and ranking cities. One that I found very instructive and relevant is that, I'm sure some of you are already aware of this, there is a UN ranking of cities, of the global cities of the world. It was a study that followed the global Millennium Development Indicators in 2012. And if you look at it visually, it's a very interesting representation. The objective is prosperity, the creation of wealth. And the way in which the UN has classified this is to put prosperity at the center, and around it you have circular arms which are supposed to contribute to the creation of wealth or the enhancement of prosperity. And they say that the first is equity and social inclusion as one of the indicators in the endeavor to create prosperity. The second, and I was very glad that this was identified, is environmental sustainability in the movement towards the creation of wealth and prosperity, which should also, I think, resonate with Mr. Sarma amongst others in this audience. The third is appropriate infrastructure. And if you read the disaggregation of infrastructure, one of the areas where there is a lot of attention paid is to public transport and its availability or lack thereof. The manner of increasing productivity. There are ways and ways of increasing productivity. And linked to this is the quality of life for the citizens and the inhabitants of the city in question. So I thought I would use this model which is available. It has obviously been arrived at by many of the experts who work on urban issues, and say that to the extent that we accept that geography shapes destiny, Vizag, I repeat and reiterate, is specially endowed. Those of you who are familiar with the geography of this city and its various attributes, I would just make a short point to say that there is an enormous potential for Vizag, both in terms of its location along the eastern seaboard, as also its connectivity with the hinterland, and that in this framework, I am taking the liberty of suggesting that all of you who have a stake in the growth of Vizag, Visakhapatnam, that I want to introduce what I call as the template of 5 E's, E as in the alphabet. And that if we now talk about how cities are evolving, particularly in India, I think there is cause for anguish. For the last few decades, I have been staying in the capital of India, New Delhi. I personally am very lucky. I live on the campus of JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And those of you who know that university would know that it's completely unlike what the rest of Delhi is. But I often hang my head in shame. Even as I was leaving Delhi, we now have the ignominy in that city. I'm a citizen of Delhi. I vote in Delhi. That we have also become the rape capital, not just of India, but almost of the world. It's not about statistics about whether or not the incidence in Delhi is lower or greater than any other median. But the fact that, as you know, today, going back to that infamous and brutal gang rape, which is now better known as the Jurrat case, when a young lady was gang raped in a moving bus, December of 2012, to where we are now. And as I was leaving Delhi a few days ago, day before, we saw this Manipuri minor. So this is just one example, as I said, of India's capital, where if you were to assess it objectively, I would make the case that it is a very inequitous city. There are various attempts now, including the arrival of the Aam Aadmi Party as a political entity, to see what difference could be made. I don't want to get into that part, except to make this as a statement, as an observation, that cities and their inhabitants, and especially those who are thinking through these issues, need to arrive at what I would call as an appropriate way of assessing the texture of the city. You know, today we have enough technology that tells you about the pollution levels in cities. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Should we use CNG? You now have technology and various means by which you can monitor the quality of water that is provided by the municipality. In the same manner, I am proposing today, in honor of Dr. Abid Hussain and the memorial lecture that we have all gathered for, that as the city becomes more relevant in the growth of India, that we need to evolve an index to assess what I would call the first indicator, the first E. How equitable is a city? Now you can take this into economics and talk about the Gini coefficient and say whether or not you have different levels of opportunity and inequity. But to extend this across the board and to equitable, I would like to say that cities and their inhabitants and those who administer those cities should also perhaps pay some attention to how empathetic is a city. Cities have texture. Texture, as you know, comes from the warp and the weft. It's a weaving term. But the little time that I have spent in some of the great cities of India, you know, each city can be felt by its texture. I know this city. I can talk about Visakhapatnam. I know a little bit of some other parts of India. Banaras, it's a great city. Despite all its other inadequacies, there is a rhythm to Banaras. There is a texture to Banaras. You could say the same thing about Allahabad. These are all places where I have spent some time. Or in peninsular India, you could talk about Mysore. those of you who know, as I said. Like this, the list goes on. And since I have recently spent some time doing some work in Rajasthan, I can only talk about the city of Jodhpur and Jaipur, which have, again, certain rhythms, certain texture. That to pay attention, what when weft comes from various elements that go into fabric. Like that, cities, towns, from their inhabitants, going back to their geography, their history, their culture, samskara of the city. That to pay attention and see to what degree we are able to monitor both the degree to which a city is equitable and it is empathetic. And in this, I subsume gender security as one of the inherent characteristics. And I think it will be fair to say that any town, any city, any collective, where the woman, the girl, feels a sense of security, I think by itself is an achievement, and it is something that could even serve as a role model for the rest of India. And, we are now at a very crucial moment, I think, even as far as the state is concerned, with the announcement about Telangana. I'm sure there would be a lot of political rearrangement. And whatever be the nomenclature for describing that which is not Telangana, I think the cities would have a very, very critical role to play, and that without waiting for any directions or cues, I'm making this plea in public that Visakhapatnam should really, I think, take certain steps in a direction that the collective deems appropriate. And to the equitable and the empathetic indicators, I want to add the third E, which is the degree to which whatever progress and prosperity is being pursued is environmentally sustainable. Because now I'm a security analyst, and one of the areas where a lot of attention needs to be paid is the correlation between human security and environmental degradation. And that we are seeing increasingly that many Faustian bargains are being struck, meaning that for short-term benefits, there are various policy initiatives that are being followed and pursued, sometimes, I think, with colossal, almost irreversible damage. And this is across the spectrum, from nuclear energy and what we know of Fukushima to various other issues. I will not go into them except to say that in Vizag's own blueprint, that environmental sustainability should be one of the elements when we talk about the future of the city and the degree to which it will realize its destiny. The fourth of the E's that I had identified is the degree to which the city and its infrastructure is able to provide and cater for education, which again is a critical component for us when we talk about the demographic opportunities that India has. You often see these comparisons between India and China, and most of the received wisdom is that India has the demographic advantage. But the corollary that follows is that absent the education, this same so-called demographic advantage can be a liability. And therefore, to ensure that education is provided in a manner that would be appropriate and also leads to employment, that education absent opportunities for employment becomes a dead alley by itself. And therefore, in the growth of the city, which I am sure the collector and various other officials and academics and citizens of the city would all be cognizant of. And finally, the last of the E's, which I often feel needs to be brought back into public discourse, is the degree to which all of these initiatives, whether at the policy level of the city and its administration or of the institution, you could belong to the university, the college, the hospital, the factory, whatever be your affiliation, the degree to which it is ethical. And here I go back to the classical definition of ethics to say that in its most pristine form, ethics is defined as enlightened self-interest. By all means, Vizag should have a self-interest at the collective level. But that self-interest, as it is disaggregated through the various parts of Visakhapatnam should be ethical in that sense, that it is a collective whose interest is being prioritized. And I say this, as I said, both with earnestness and with a lot of humility, to say that my own experience is not in urban issues, much less about cities. But recently, a few years ago, in relation to Delhi and internal security, I was part of a small study group that was trying to make some extrapolations about the security of cities, internal security. And one of the findings, and there were various other experts who came, I was more as a person who was absorbing what was being said, is that there is a very huge challenge growing in India today, which is the equivalent of the city within the city, or perhaps I should say the slum within the city, the jhuggi within the city. You know, depending on which part of India you are, you have different languages, different words to describe this. But this is both a case of the inequity starkly seen in Mumbai, and I'm sure it's now becoming more visible in other parts of India, where with this pattern of what I describe as uneven growth, unsustainable growth, inequitous growth, we have two levels of the city. One, the traditional city that is recognized both in terms of the municipal records, and you have the emerging clusters. Sometimes they do not have a permanent physical location, a shifting demography, and that these have the potential to impact adversely what is taken for granted, the security and the stability and the rhythms of the city. Cities are in the business of providing both a safe environment for the citizens, all the infrastructure that goes with it. Why do people come from every hamlet around Visakhapatnam in this far-flung district to make their way to the King George's Hospital, to the emergency? Because it is part of the infrastructure of the city. But unless we are able to recognize these patterns, and I'm only giving you one small sliver, we were looking at this in terms of the impact on internal security and terrorism and various other aspects. But I'm extrapolating this and saying that as part of today's effort in recalling Dr. Abid Hussain, that this vision, the city of destiny, that what is it that Mr. Sharma spoke about, the new generations that follow. In Mr. Arokiraj, we have one more collector who has followed in this tradition of the great collectors of Visakhapatnam. And he represents, as I said, the state, the municipality, and the city's many aspirations and anxieties. But this is a blueprint, an effort that needs everybody's participation. So I am taking the liberty, if I may, in this August gathering, to say that Vizag should evolve its own blueprint. This is a city that, as one of our speakers earlier before me pointed out, Sir Sarvepalli was here as a Vice-Chancellor. We've had various other luminaries in this city, and I'm sure there will be more. But that Vizag don't take the lead. This is not about a race that Vizag should be first or somebody else should be second. But in its own enlightened self-interest, that Vizag should now evolve a blueprint. I'm only suggesting that these 5 E's could offer some kind of a benchmark or a way ahead, and that this would perhaps be one way of realizing the destiny. I do not want to detail and say that Vizag, with a little bit of application of mind, both at the center in New Delhi and by the state and the city, has the potential to become one of the most successful ports of India. India's future is linked to its ports, and amongst its ports, in terms of the space and capacity available, Vizag is preeminent. I say this with some awareness of the subject. Vizag's ability to actually catalyze and kickstart inland maritime marine transport, coastal shipping, is immense. Vizag's ability to be able to provide appropriate connectivity with the hinterland, Vizag's ability to be a node for education. Vizag has the potential to be a great center for tourism. And I'm saying all this because I've been sitting on various subcommittees and groups which are here in Delhi for the last 10 years. What Bihar has not been able to do, which is to provide the appropriate, what I call as the Buddhist tour of India, for which there is enormous demand. One of these days, you all should get Ambassador Dasgupta to talk to you in ASEAN, in Japan, rest of East Asia. We are sitting, and this is something that I have also done a little work on, so I'm reasonably aware. I'm just flagging this to say that the potential for Vizag is considerable, but it needs, as I said, the right synergies. And none of this will happen unless what I would say is that there is a blueprint that is appropriate. So I'm taking the liberty of suggesting these 5 E's. And the last point, if I could take a few more minutes, in the spirit of being here today and recalling Abid Saab, both his vision for Vizag and for India. I have said this in the past in private. Today I'm taking the liberty of saying this in public, since Professor Prasanna Kumar and I have spoken about this many times. And I have also had occasion to discuss this with Abid Saab when he had finished with the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation and he was doing various things. That at that time, there was this sense that Hyderabad, and I'm talking about the time when we had the Telugu Desam at the center in Vizag, in Hyderabad, that he felt that there was a need to create, he used to come to the India International Center very often. Most of you may know the IIC. And he used to say, ki, bhai, Uday, kuch karna chahiye. Hyderabad mein kuch karna chahiye. And he felt that he could get some support, but his vision again was that IIC and what it provides needs to be replicated in many parts of India. Now, I'll leave the Hyderabad story aside. Various things have happened today in the state. But again, to make a very earnest and well-meaning suggestion, that I personally feel, and I think some of you may share this sentiment, that Vizag now has reached a point of takeoff, if I may use that particular phrase, to have the equivalent of an international center. A forum where deliberations of this type, we are becoming global, no doubt, but global has to go with local. So we talk about glocal. I am earnestly suggesting that this august body consider the creation of the equivalent of an international center in Visakhapatnam, and if there is consensus, perhaps it could even be named as the Abid Hussain International Center, or what the nomenclature you can decide. But I believe that it would give us, and here I consider myself to be part of us, one of you, that the citizens of Visakhapatnam and its own inclusive character will allow us, to absorb many winds, many talents. And again, I say this with conviction that whenever I travel out of India, occasionally, whatever be the forum, wherever there is diaspora, which has a Vizag connection. It can be anything. It can be Timpani School, AIPM, St. Aloysius, Avian College, Andhra University, Lankabullaya, you name it. And there is an enormous yearning to say that we want to give something back. What is it that we can do? Today's technology allows you, to make these connections. So it's in that spirit I am suggesting that perhaps, the wise men of Visakhapatnam and the wise women of Visakhapatnam can collectively think of how best to recall Abid Saab, the vision, and see whether or not the city of destiny can really become what all of us hope it will in the most normative and positive sense of the term. Thank you very much. Grateful to you for your patience and